Indie comics are all the rage these days, but some indie comics are made by relative unknowns, and others are made by creators named Mark Millar or Jeff Johns or Rick Remender. And all of those books and all of those creators fall under the bubble of what we refer to as indie. But should those comics count? Should comics by creators whose names alone can bring the boys to the yard count as indie? That's the question that we are here to answer today.
So it's interesting. Indie as a concept generally falls under the company umbrella, right? If you're not the big two, you're indie. You could stretch that to Image being, a big three, maybe, but Image's whole brand is indie, right? So where do the creators within that fall? Is Daniel Warren Johnson on Transformers indie?
No, but then he's a interesting figure because he came up out of the realm and the world that was not necessarily the big two, Extremity, Murder Falcon,
Yeah.
and he made a name for himself there before doing, what was it, the Wonder Woman Dead Earth, I think it was. Um, so
Beta Ray Bill.
Beta Ray
Yeah.
Bill, I would say technically yes, because he doesn't persist in the main big two universes. He is a name in comics, uh, purely out of comics, but not in the stable of corporate comics. And now that he's entered, but now that he's entered Image and Energon
IP. Yeah.
IP, but then even then, IP can be technically indie. You can have stuff like, what is it, the Martian rat whatever things. What's the other
Biker,
Biker
the
mice.
biker mice
Biker-
from Mars.
right?
Wow.
Like that to me is, yes, it was a property, yes, it has its history, but that to me is indie on a different level, still being IP even.
It's tough because IP comics have a much, much better shot at success in the comic space than, any old random indie book. But when I think about indie, I'm thinking about, really, I just use that word as an easy way to say not Marvel or not DC
Mm-hmm.
more than anything. But if we're really getting down to the nitty gritty of it, um, I guess independent comics really shouldn't count. IP comics really shouldn't count as indie. But then again, is Daniel Warren Johnson less entrenched in the big two, or yeah, less entrenched in the big two than Mark Millar is? I would say he's more entrenched because Mark Millar hasn't
Now,
worked for the big two in a decade.
That's true. Yeah.
but I would argue it's because of his work at the big two that his sales and everything have garnered him that success.
Of course, but that's true for everybody. Everybody who gets a shot at the big two and then leaves has a bigger shot at success outside the big two. You can make that
Right.
argument for Jeff Johns. You can make it for Daniel Warren Johnson, whoever.
So is this a, then this feels more like a categorical issue, right? There must be an intermediary between indie that is not up and coming, but is established and independent in the sense that they're not associated with the big two corporate comics, compared to a indie that is, the creator at an SPX literally selling their wares of a 30 printed issue.
Here's a name I'm thinking of: Matthew Rosenberg. He's done a solid amount of work at Marvel. I'm not positive he's done anything at DC.
Yes, he is right now.
Okay. But he's done a solid plethora of indie books, and I'd say he's actually independent books, aside from the big two. Um, but I would say while his name is out there, it's not one of the necessarily popular ones. That's the kind of creator that I think you could get away with labeling indie versus someone like Jeff Johns or Mark Millar.
I mean, if we're talking about independent creators, then that sounds to me like we're talking about creator-owned work. Because if Matt Rosenberg works for the same company that Jeff Johns does, Image Comics, right? So if it's about creators, and we're talking creator-owned work, then I would say that they all fall under that umbrella.
Yeah, it's just like the scale to which they can attract people, even. But I guess like as Image has come up with all of these sub publishers, you have the rise of things like um, Robert Kirkman. You have a Walking Dead, an Invincible. I mean, at that point, do we demote Image from being indie?
At what point are these people a company unto themselves?
I mean, Mark Millar has Millar World or Miller World, so
Yeah.
you know, that's um, that's a pretty big deal, I guess. But I don't know, man. When Robert Kirkman did Walking Dead and Invincible, he was a nobody. Certainly now he's not a nobody, but does that change the status of those works? Does it retroactively like not diminish, but like take away the success? I don't think so. Is Spawn indie? It
Well,
certainly was when it started.
yeah, that's not just. It's certainly not to diminish the success. Certainly, it's more. I think it's more of just like a classification. Is there another word we could use for these people? Your McFarlane, your Jeff Johns, your
Super indie.
Creators of indie creators of fame.
Like what how like okay, in working through the classification,
Mm.
what are we hoping to achieve? To create a separation between super indie, superstar creators who are working outside of the big two versus people who are still trying to make their bones. We know that there's a gulf between Jeff Johns and Matthew Rosenberg, for example, I guess. But they work for the same company
Mm.
and their books appear on the same stands. It's not like a guy selling a zine for, selling a zine out the back of his truck, sort of like what Marco was establishing earlier.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a weird situation because Matthew Rosenberg's book has just as much of a shot at success, except for his name.
Well, how about the introduction of something like an underground comics or comics with an X as the distinguisher, and indie being purely classification for creator owned books, and so you can fit in a Jeff Johns in the same way that you can fit in a Patrick Horvath of Between the Trees, Beneath the Trees Where Nobody Sees, and they can live under the same umbrella, and you can reference the same thing as one a creator who has that independent work outside of the realm of a, let's say, IP or Marvel DC.
So maybe something like, so you've got Marvel and DC as like corporate comics, and then you've got your Jeff Johns, your Patrick Horvath, guys who, and this would encompass Rosenberg in within this conversation as well. Guys who do the Image, the IDW, the Boom as like company comics, and then you have your underground zine people.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's kind of how I already think about it. Like, I definitely make a distinction between Patrick Horvath and, like one of those like a Mr. Boop or something like that, right?
Mm.
There's definitely a distinction in my mind, but I don't really make a distinction in my mind between, say, Patrick Horvath and like Jeff Johns. Because Patrick Horvath, we're saying this, but Patrick Horvath had one of the biggest books of the year a couple years ago, and he was a nobody. Nobody knew who he was at all. So for me, it's like, yeah, Jeff Johns is a bigger name, but Patrick Horvath, that didn't matter when Beneath the Trees came out.
Horvath has a name.
Now
Yeah.
he does, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Is there a before and after situation then? Because he let's say that didn't take off the way it did, he would still exist creating comics, Free for All being one of the more recent releases, and it wouldn't have the same maybe volume or buzz it does because he hasn't established himself. So maybe there's a distinction between an established indie and an up and coming indie. The Jeff Johns, once you have that past that threshold, you can start to take advantage of your name brand.
We'll see if that plays out that way for a Patrick Horvath,
Mm.
because Beneath the Trees was a massive success. I'm sure that the sequel will do really well, but does that mean that what his name is on is bankable? I don't think so. I don't think so. I think it's very case by case. Al Ewing
That's a
came
good point. Yeah.
from Marvel, off Immortal Hulk, one of the biggest Marvel books in the last decade. He did we only find them when they're dead, and that book died on the vine. In my mind, I truly think it's about the market, and it has very little to do with the creator. Because Bendis is one of the biggest creators ever in the history of comics, and he's got trouble selling.
His indie stuff, yeah, it's true.
Yeah. From a number standpoint, he's more indie than Patrick Horvath is.
Oof,
Yeah.
that's wild to think
That's
about.
true.
None of his books have hit.
So you said from a market, like a market standpoint, then are we saying, hey, this is a 100K batter, this is a 200K batter, like what? Yeah, this guy got a 400K pre-order type situation. They got
I
power levels.
I genuinely think it's case by case, and it's like every time you're up to bat, it could be a different like it. No, I don't think that there are too many creators. Like, I think James Tynion, excuse me, is that guy. He's that Mike
Yeah.
Judge or whatever. He's gonna come out and he's gonna knock it out the park pretty much every time. But outside of him, I don't think there's an indie creator that I can think of from a number standpoint who's gonna do that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's
I was almost like, wait, what about the guy from Something's Killing the Children?
especially these days, right? Like, your image boom, you had your Brian K. Vaughan, I would even put Gillen up there,
Sure.
Fraction.
But maybe not now. But I feel like Vaughn, I don't know if I would say this about, but like Gillen is a bit more focused in what he's doing, whereas Tynan is a bit more scattershot, but a bit more successful. Like he's making a library.
Yeah.
Tiny,
Yeah, like go ahead.
sorry, I was just gonna add. The Tiny Onion is now a thing.
Yeah.
He is it's like a Rick Remender, like just,
Yeah. Yeah.
banging out book after book after book. They don't take years to get a new book out. Kieran Gillen, he's got one book out, and I'd be shocked if we got another.
Mhm.
whereas Rick right now probably has 4 out.
And I guess it's interesting too because you have the likes of a Jason Aaron who uh, was at Marvel for a long time, kind of went dormant, had his own indies who that finished or didn't, and now feels like is on corporate comics, IP comics, indie stuff with Bug Wars. Like there's a lot brewing for that individual as well. That how do you then categorize him? He's working for in all three of those buckets.
Yeah, I mean, to me, Jason Aaron is a big two guy. I like
Yeah.
he's dabbling right now, and it's great stuff. But when I think about Jason Aaron, I think of Marvel and then now, DC in a lot of ways. Like a hired gun. He's a mercenary, but a mercenary that I think will always go home to the big two. Kelly Thompson is another one of those people. She can do big two work, but she can also do, an indie. She's got the Black Cloak. She had the Call. She's doing GI Joe stuff, which I guess we said is not indie, but she's all over the place. Is the point?
I mean, then going back to the question originally posed, is Mark Millar's new Vatican City book um, indie? I think at this point, off the conversation, yes, and the name here doesn't matter because it's a creator-owned work.
Indie, but in this classification, we've created a company comic. It's an image,
Millar
right?
Millar's stuff comes out through Dark Horse, I believe, in partnership with Netflix. He's a very interesting person to talk about here. I think Millar's name matters, but in the same way that seeing a name you really care about on the indie space matters. Remember, Mark Millar had massive success on the indie side of things at the same time as huge success at the big two 20 years ago, at the exact same time. That is not that common. So I would say yes, he's indie, but he does have a machine behind him to some degree. He's got Netflix behind him, you know.
Mm.
Um, I'm sure Dark Horse would like to see those books be successes. So he's got something behind him. And I guess in that respect, a guy like Mark, a guy like Rick who has Giant Generator, a guy like Jeff Johns who has Ghost Machine is different than even a Patrick Horvath who doesn't have any kind of particular machine behind him.
Now you're getting it.
Okay.
Now I'm getting it.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think you're clicking into what I'm saying, or what the
What the point
you're
is. Yeah.
clicking into the reason when we talk about Jeff Johns as an indie, I roll my eyes, right? Like,
It's
dude's not
funny.
an indie; he's got something behind him. Like,
Yeah. I just think of indie as non-big two because the big two are responsible for like 90+% of the pie.
yeah,
That's why.
yeah,
But I
yeah,
do
yeah.
think it's funny when we say, Jeff Johns is indie. How could that be?
Ghost
Yeah.
Machine and all its list of its murderer's row of creators is indie.
It's the murderer's row of Jeff Johns books.
Yeah.
Distillery is a company that has you talk about a murderer's row. They've got a lot of talent, but they've also got money being infused coming from people outside in Hollywood and things like that. They've got a machine behind them too, but I think of those books as indie.
Yeah, yeah, but I think a higher class of indie because of, I would argue, because you've got the corporate creators who have another angle, right? Your Rom V, your McKelvey. Um, I don't know any other distillery books.
Yeah, they have. Yeah, I see that. I guess if Patrick Horvath, and he might even be a bad example now, if Matthew Rosenberg fixes himself to do a new comic, he's got to get the creator, like the artist, he's got to get he's got to assemble his team. He's got to do all that grunt work.
Yeah.
And the only thing Image is going to do for him is say, all right, we'll press it up and we'll get it to stores, and that's it. We're not going to market you. We're not really going to do anything for you. I don't know for a fact how the ins and outs of distillery operate. I don't know if it's quite the same. I don't think it is, because you're talking about people that have ownership stake versus a hired hand.
Yep. Yeah. Plus, with distillery, you have the weird aftermarket of it all as well.
Yeah.
And who knows how that money shakes out.
Or what that
If
money
that
even
money
is.
shakes out.
Right.
Yeah.
And also, quite frankly, distillery is not open to anyone outside of that circle, in the sense that, like, Rom V can bring on whoever he wants, but I can't submit to distillery.
Right.
Can't pitch in
Right.
to keep
It's
with
insular.
to keep with these baseball references.
I got Mike Judge out of the ether. I don't know a fucking thing about baseball.
Hey,
Is that a baseball reference? I thought that was the guy that made King of the Hill.
God, that isn't Mike Judge on the Yankees? I think he's on the Yankees.
that sounds right. That sounds right.
I don't know anything about the Yankees.
The Texas
Me
boy.
neither, apparently. Let us know in the comments, though. Forget your Yankee knowledge. Do you have knowledge? Who do you think is considered indie? Do you believe that it's just whoever's not in the big two, or do you feel like it's more nuanced than that? How would you break out your classification of indie comics creators and indie companies? I do think that there is value in trying to figure this out, because then you can have a better understanding of how to talk about these books, maybe even how to market them, where they should be going, whose hands they need to get into. So there are a lot of nuances and stuff like that. Leave your thoughts in the comments. We will see you in the next one.